Professor Grutendorst, I want to ask you, what do you think some policy solutions are to make drugs like Soliris, $500,000 to $700,000 a year, to make it more affordable so patients can actually access it?
Well, to improve patient access, you cover it for them. So you shift the cost to a third party, like a public drug plan or an insurance, employer-based insurance. It gets paid eventually, of course, by lower wages or by taxes.
Right.
Um, if you want to lower the cost that's being paid to the drug company, then you have to think about other ways of making it easier for them to do the R&D. You can think about a whole range of ways of lowering the cost through clinical trial subsidies, or perhaps you can think about expanding support for basic research, or you can think about as well having some agreement internationally about how much each country should pay towards the cost of these things, so that the US doesn't get stuck with it all and Canada doesn't get stuck with it all. So you make Australia pay a bit more for it.
For the research and development to
No,
create.
well, for the implicitly for the price of the drug through supports. They have to, New Zealand is a good example of a country that free rides. So you make them say, hey guys, you guys got to pay a bit more, and you can do it in one of three ways. You can pay more for the price of the drug, or you can amp up your support through basic research, or you can amp up your support for clinical trials, or you can do something else. But you got to do something.
So Matt, I'm interested in your perspective. What do you think are some ways? I know your goal, as well as with all our goals, is to make these drugs accessible to patients. What are some of the ways that you think that could be better achieved?
Yeah, well, as has been discussed, the patents are a big driver on this. So some would argue that you should remove these patent protections, but it is the case that it's very expensive to make drugs, and probably no one's going to do it if someone else can immediately copy the formula. One thing you could do to get some of those costs down is to remove some of the regulations and restrictions on the development of the drug, in terms of how many trials, how long it has to go through. And of course, you got to keep safety in mind, but possibly some of that red tape could be cut. And finally, I'll just add that this seems like a case to me where this is, so if there's a case for public health care, and I'm skeptical on that sometimes, but this is the one, a very expensive drug, right? Instead, public health care covers things like the $30 COVID vaccine that I got but would have happily paid for, and then puts up a fuss when it comes to these expensive things, where really that seems to me like that should be perhaps the purpose of that public system.
Interesting. So Professor Gold, I want to ask you about some constitutional challenges that have occurred related to the drug pricing system. I know there was one in 2015 related to this same company that develops Soliris, is a company called Alexion. And I know there have been some other recent constitutional challenges. What are the basis of those challenges on drug pricing, and where do they stand now?
Yeah, there are a whole bunch of challenges. So far, everybody's lost. It's gone up to the Supreme Court. I think that's the way it's going to end up. But the new challenges are, in Quebec, for example, they said this should be provincially regulated, not federally regulated. It's the same old type of argument we've heard, that patent law only is this very technical thing and doesn't affect prices, which is ridiculous because the whole purpose of patents is to regulate prices. But that's the constitutional challenge. They lost at trial. It will go up to the provincial court here of appeal, and eventually probably make it to the Supreme Court.
Okay, so that's some of the challenges. I want to ask you the same question that I asked Professor Grutendorst and Mr. Buffton. What do you think could be done to make prices for drugs more accessible for patients?
So there are two different categories. So the drugs we have, and we're kind of stuck with the tools we have. There's not tons we can do. We can just pay for them, as both Matt and Paul were talking about. But if we're talking about new drugs, then we have to figure out ways to lower cost. I'm not sure I agree with Matt that we lower regulatory standards, because that's been a problem, for example, with the vaccine, where people don't feel it's been tested enough. But there are other things we do. We're highly inefficient. We don't share knowledge. So company A investigates a drug, finds that it doesn't work, doesn't tell anybody. So company B does the same thing over and over and over again. We waste millions, billions doing this type of inefficient research. We can fix that.